We're Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to the first InspirASIAN series of the semester, featuring, before we start, I would like to say that my name is Dr. Nina Ha, and I'm the director of the Asian Cultural Engagement Center. And I would like to start with the land acknowledgement and legal recognition. Virginia Tech acknowledges that we live and work on the Tulalip and Monacan people's homeland, and we recognize their continued relationships with their lands and waterways. We further acknowledge that legislation and practices like the Morrill Act of 1862 enabled the Commonwealth of Virginia to finance and found Virginia Tech through the forced removal of Native nations from their lands, both locally and in Western territories. We understand that honoring Native peoples without explicit material commitments falls short of our institutional responsibilities. Through sustained, transparent, and meaningful engagement with the Tulalip and Monacan peoples and other Native nations, we commit to changing the trajectory of Virginia Tech's history by increasing Indigenous student, staff, and faculty recruitment and retention, diversifying course offerings, and meeting the growing needs of all Virginia tribes and supporting their sovereignty. We must also recognize that enslaved people generated revenue and resources used to establish Virginia Tech and were prohibited from attending until 1953. Through inclusive VT, the institutional and individual commitment to UTPROSM that I may serve in the spirit of community, diversity, and excellence, we commit to advancing a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. So welcome, everybody. I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. S. Cassinelli, who is an assistant professor in the English department and for the Women's and Gender Studies program. He will present a brief description of recent transnational adoption narratives and discuss how these newer works approach themes of belonging and Asian American identity. Dr. Cassinelli.
Haven't done this in a while. I was muted for a moment. How's everyone doing? Good. You, from our vantage point, you all look quite far away. So thank you for making some noise. So let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. Hi, I'm Dr. S. Cassinelli. It's really nice to meet you all. Like Dr. Ha said, I'm an assistant professor in the English department, and I also teach for the Women and Gender Studies program. So I've been at Virginia Tech since fall of 2018. I started as a teaching postdoc fellow, and then my job was converted to a more permanent position, and this is my second year as an assistant professor. I last lived in Illinois, where I attended the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign for my PhD. I grew up in Rhode Island, just to tell you a little bit about myself, and my most favorite place ever is the ocean. My favorite weather is actually when it's gray and rainy, so today has been like a fantastic day in my humble opinion, even though I know it's not everyone's favorite weather. And just a little bit more about me. I'm a classic Virgo and my cat has an Instagram. Can everyone hear me well enough? Okay, fantastic. So this is my cat. This is Rosemary. As you can see, she's quite photogenic. And, you know, in the past, people have asked for the handle, so I put it on the slide. Can you see it? Okay, excellent. All right. Like Dr. Ha said, today I'm going to be talking about transnational adoption narratives and how they are interpreted. And I'm mostly going to tell you a bit about my own research and what I choose to focus on. And then I'll talk about some newer or some more recent developments in transnational adoption narratives. And we can carry that conversation over into the Q&A if you would like. So right now, what I'm about to tell you is based on a book manuscript that I'm working on, and that is based off of the work I did as a doctoral student, my dissertation, And so my title right now is Exceptional Subjects, Cold War Family Formations, and Queer Kinships in Korean American Diasporic Narratives. I focus on contemporary fiction. So as a literary scholar, that means novels and documentary films and memoirs that were published from the 1980s to a present moment. And see, these are some of the books and documentary films that I look at. Just to give you a sense of the context for my work, I'm predominantly interested in something called the Korean diaspora. And so that is looking at the movement of Koreans to the United States throughout the 20th century, mostly configured around the mid 20th century, the 1950s to a present moment. But to kind of understand what I'm interested in, there are other historical events that are also important. So the end of Japan's colonial rule over Korea, which ended in 1945, the neo-colonial relationship between the United States and following World War II, the Korean War itself, which was 1950 to 1953, and what's known as US Cold War policies of integration and expansion that happened following World War II around 1945 through till the 1980s, and the figure of the Korean War orphan and the American nuclear family. So those are all things that I look at in my research on transnational adoption and how we interpret narratives. Let's see, why won't it? Okay, so the main argument of my discussion is that alternative kinship models within the selected text of the slide that I just showed you, where it listed all those books, they register the fractures and formations created by militarization and US involvement in Asian wars, revealing the inextricable nature of queer and normative intimacies that shape the Korean diaspora. So what does that mean? When we talk about transnational adoption, a lot of people focus on the adoptee, the child who's being adopted, and the family that they're being adopted into. And that is that when a child is adopted into a family, it makes a complete structure, 2 parents and a child. It makes a nuclear family. And what I look at in my selected texts are alternative kinship models, where people are, maybe they're related, or maybe they're affiliated, maybe they have different points of connection because of what militarization made possible, because of US soldiers in Asia, because of war, but the various types of relationships, otherwise known as kinship models, that form because of militarization and US involvement. And so what that creates are what I'm calling queer and normative intimacies that shape this experience of the Korean diaspora. So what's an example of what I'm talking about? There are 2 documentaries in particular that I study that feature, as you can see at the top of the slide, US Korean adoptees self-representation. And so what it means to be adopted from an adoptee's perspective. And there are these 2 documentary films. The first called, the one with the parent and the child on what's my left-hand side of the screen, is called First Person Plural. And that documentary film is predominantly about what it's like to be adopted and to be raised in a white family in the United States, and how the family thought about adoption versus how the adoptee thinks about adoption. And then the one with the adult holding the microfilm image is from the film In Search of Chang Jung-hee. And that is a documentary film about going to Korea and finding more information about one's adopted past. And these are 2 very good examples of how to narrate the adopted experience. One, what it's like to be adopted in a white American family, and to wonder if you have another family out there, and two, what it's like to go back to Korea and try to find more information. So in first person plural by Diane Borché-Lim, what we have is a story of Diane Borché. And Diane Borché is a person with the jacket and the kind of short hair in the front of the photo. And Diane Borché-Lim was adopted from Korea in the 1960s. And as she tells in her documentary movie about her experience, what she found out, or what she remembers, is right before she was to get put on the plane, the director of the Korean orphanage said, "Don't tell your adopted parents who you really are until you're old enough to live on your own." And it's because Diane Borché-Lim was adopted and given the name, Cha Jung-hee. And so her American parents thought that they were adopting a young orphan named Cha Jung-hee. And documents were forged and then Cha Jung-hee was given the American name Diane Borché. But as it turns out, Cha Jung-hee was somebody else who returned to her biological family. And in her place, Diane Borché was put on a plane and sent to the United States and adopted by this family. And so very often with transnational adoption narratives, there is a kind of genre or formula that is followed, where the adoptee returns to a foreign land, one that they're not very familiar with. They seek out birth mothers or biological kin. They have an emotional, life-changing reunion. And then the goal, or what people expect to happen at the end of the narrative, is that there's some closure about being adopted. And what is interesting about Diane Borché-Lim's films is that it sets up this premise of what if closure is not always possible, especially when, for instance, the adoption starts at a place of not knowing the complete story, or not beginning from a place of total truth. Let's see. Here we go. And so one of the things that I look at, or an interpretive practice that I bring to transnational adoption narratives, is that instead of thinking about the closure that's supposed to come when an adoptee goes back to another country, or is even able to find biological family members, is thinking about something that I refer to as multi-directional forms of attachment. How in an adoption process, there is more than just the adoptee and the biological family members, but there are all these other individuals who are involved. And this photo, this screenshot from one of the documentaries, kind of shows you the many faces of Cha Jung-hee, the orphan, and how Diane Borché-Lim, who's in the center in the bottom row in the passport photo, how she is actually connected to all of these different individuals, even if she doesn't know them directly and even if she hasn't made a direct connection with them with the search and reunion narrative. So some of the things I think about are in my project are how what I call queer genealogies, and it helps us think about these multi-directional forms of attachment. I think about how migrations or journeys back to countries of origin, like Korea, even when they're done in search of answers, are not conventional or pathological. They can't simply be kind of fit into a genre and explained fully. Instead, I think of them as flexible processes informed by colonial intimacies and diasporic histories. I think about how the conditions of Korean adoption within the Korean diaspora construct kinship relations that exceed normative family relations and national belonging. And how queer genealogies enable adoptees like C Lim to connect with their Korean culture and history without condoning the institutions, the circumstances, or the policies that use transnational adoption to fortify the nation state. And I'm guessing that you can probably see Rosemary. She's totally joined the conversation. So what are some other directions in Asian transnational adoption narratives? So in addition to thinking about the many different relationships that could be a part of a transnational adoption experience, there are also something called feminist methodologies, and that's thinking about transnational adoption from a feminist and women's history perspective. And that includes expanded discussions of motherhood and the sociopolitical realities connected to adoption. So the very simple narrative that is often told to adoptees is your birth mother had you, but couldn't take care of you. Or she loved you, but she knew that you would have a better life if she gave you up for adoption. And so you were sent to us and we adopted you and we love you. And in that example, you can see how the birth mother plays a very significant role, but then very quickly disappears from the conversation. And so feminist methodologies want to think more about the socio-political or the reasons why mothers feel as though they can't take care of their children. And this has to do with, resources given to single parent households or stigmas attached to single parent households and things like that. Another way of looking at transnational adoption narratives is thinking about how adoption narratives are a type of immigrant narrative. And so for a while, immigrant narratives were thought of as one thing and adoption narratives were thought of as another, but scholars are bringing them together and thinking about an immigrant and an adoptee are both individuals who cross borders, who live multicultural lives, that adoptees might be a type of an immigrant. And with regards to adoption, this actually also includes instances of deportation and issues with citizenship status. So it's really easy to imagine if you're adopted, then you're just automatically a citizen of the country that you've been adopted into. And in the case of the United States, that's actually only been the case for approximately 25 years. So it used to be if you were adopted in the 60s, like Diane Borche-Lim, or if you were adopted in the 80s, which was the height of Korean transnational adoption, or when the most amount of children came over from Korea to the United States, those children would still have to be naturalized to become US citizens. And so in some cases, adopted parents never got around to getting their children naturalized. And if an adoptee were to commit a crime that would warrant deportation, then someone who's adopted could get deported back to a country that they have no connection to. And immigration scholars talk about the level of stress that that would entail. Another way of looking at transnational adoption narratives is as a diasporic experience. And that includes narratives that aren't focused exclusively on a sense of here, as in the United States, and a sense of there, as in another country, and thinking about how those things are not so distinct or easy to compare off of each other, like the US is so different from Korea, or Korea is so different from the US. Transnational adoption industrial complex, and that's how multiple state agencies work together to create and sustain global industries. And there are also the examples of fictional narratives in which being adopted is not the entire story of the protagonist, but a part of a story. So there are some really great fictional narratives where the adoption just isn't the central theme, but it is a part of how a character relates to themselves or others. And so Monique Trong's Bitter in the Mouth is one example where synesthesia, the ability to taste words and sounds, is actually the focus of the book, hence the title Bitter in the Mouth, but adoption does play a role. Or Matthew Salacy's recent novel, Disappear, Doppelganger Disappear, where the protagonist is adopted, but it's also a bit of a suspenseful, it's like a bit of a sci-fi novel. And so instead of adoption being the whole genre, it's actually a suspense novel in which adoption just only plays a part. Or the recent memoir by Nicole Chung, All You Can Ever Know. And instead of that just being a memoir where Nicole talks about finding her birth parents and it's only a focus on the adopted child and the birth parents, Nicole predominantly describes her experience of being a mother and giving birth to her own child and how that feels for an adoptee, and also the relationships that she establishes with her birth or with her biological sister. So instead of it being about the biological parents, there's another type of family or kinship relationship that's kind of foregrounded. So these are all things we can talk about more in the Q&A. If you have any questions or comments or things that you want to know more information about. And that is my very brief summary of some of the work that I do and my research. So thank you very much. And if you want, you can take a class with me. This spring, I'm teaching a Women in Gender Studies course, 2284, LGBTQ issues. As you might have picked up from my presentation, one of the things that I study are histories of sexuality in queer studies. And so that's what this class is about. Thank you very much.
We really appreciate it. And we will do the question and answer at the very end. So we will move on to our next speaker. Okay, I'm looking for our next speaker.
That's me, right?
Yes, that is you. Wait,
Okay.
wait, hold on. I'm trying to pin. There you are. Just making sure. And then how do I unpin? Just, how do I? Is it the three dots? Okay. Okay, that works too. Okay, Dr. Theodore C. Lim is an assistant professor of urban affairs and planning in the School of Public and International Affairs. He will talk about balancing citizen engagement with state-of-the-art data and modeling resources to support environmental decision-making. Thank you.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Let me do the, oops. All right. Does that still look okay?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to be talking about environmental data and models in the wild. And by that, I mean in messy reality. So a lot of times scientists use models for scientific research. As I'll talk about in this talk, I'm really, a lot of the focus of my research has to do with where environmental science meets the messiness of reality and decision-making in real life circumstances when there are all kinds of politics involved and special interests and all that. And the particular example that I'll be talking about today is some of my work with urban heat islands in Roanoke. All right, so a little bit about me. My research, I've got research projects going on in three major areas: urban stormwater and heat management infrastructure, which I'll talk about today. I also study bioenergy and carbon capture and storage infrastructure, and then the politics of urban and environmental data and models. And then in terms of teaching, I teach classes related to urban infrastructure and environmental planning and policy, urban analytics, and data and policy making. And then just a few things that I won't go into too much here, but where I've been and how I've gotten here. And I started here at Virginia Tech in 2019 as an assistant professor. All right, so what is the urban heat island effect? Some of you may be familiar with this term, but it basically describes the phenomenon that urbanized areas or built up areas where we have development, buildings, infrastructure, tend to be hotter than their rural counterparts. That's because there's usually less vegetation. Vegetation makes things cooler through shade and also through evapotranspiration, which cools things down a little bit and moves water through the environment. And also because the materials and albedos or colors of surfaces in urban areas tend to attract and hold heat for longer. So, when things tend to cool down at night, especially in urbanized areas, those temperatures don't really go down as much as they should as much as they do in surrounding rural areas. But it's not just that urban areas tend to be hotter than the surrounding rural areas. There's actually quite a lot of difference in temperature that can be experienced within an urbanized area. Like many unfair things in our world, this also tends to be correlated. Higher temperatures tend to be correlated with areas that have seen systemic racism, intergenerational poverty, decades and generations of disinvestment. And so what I have on the left here is the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map. And if any of you, some of you probably have not heard of redlining before, so I'll just quickly explain what that is. Redlining was a practice that was state-sanctioned housing segregation, basically, that lasted all the way through. It was legal until the late 60s. So what would happen was mortgages were granted in certain areas of the city to certain people, and in order to protect property values, these lines or boundaries were drawn within cities to designate high-risk areas versus low-risk areas for investment. And lo and behold, those high-risk and low-risk areas correspond to where we would allow or not allow people of color, specifically Black people, to purchase homes, because racist times of the era, like people's property values would fall if like Black people started moving into the neighborhoods. So what they did was they systematically divided up areas of the city where Black people could get loans to buy homes and where only white people would be approved for mortgages to buy homes. Even though this practice was outlawed in the late 1960s, the legacies of redlining persist today. So you can still see, this is St. Louis where I used to live, and I used to live, over here where you can see there, the red areas were considered risky areas, and that's why it's called redlining. Whereas the greener, more suburban areas were considered areas where properties would be safe from the threat, quote unquote, of Black people moving in and affecting the property values. So not surprisingly, even though this practice is illegal today, the legacies are still there because a lot of the historically redlined areas continued to suffer from disinvestment, not being served by infrastructure, not having job opportunities located nearby, et cetera. And what you see on the right here is if we take land surface temperatures measured by satellites of the different temperatures within a urbanized area, the lighter yellow areas designate places that are much hotter, whereas the deeper purple hues are places that are cooler. And you can see that there is like a 20-degree difference, Celsius difference in land surface temperatures here. You can even start to make out, transportation networks here because infrastructure tends to hold that heat in, especially at night. And so what people have done is they've actually taken the boundaries of these redlined areas and averaged the temperatures that we can measure by satellite in each of those areas. And they show that systematically areas that were previously redlined, the D class of properties, according to these Hulk maps, are systematically hotter than average across the city. And these are from present day. Now, why is that? highways tend to be aligned through so that they cut through neighborhoods that are usually less wealthy and have higher proportions of Black residents. Also, those areas have much less tree canopy cover, are more densely kind of built up, and don't have as much, are not served by parks as much or have as much landscaping. So those are all issues that can contribute to higher levels of heat. And I should also say that heat, extreme heat, is the #1 natural disaster related cause of death in the United States, more than flooding, more than hurricanes, more than wildfires. It's just typically that it doesn't get that much press coverage. And you might also imagine that in cities, it's not the numbers of deaths and hospitalizations occurring because of extreme heat are not equally distributed. So these areas that are disproportionately hotter also, may have fewer resources, may have less access to air conditioning, may have fewer social support networks. And so those are the areas that we also see suffer disproportionately from heat exposure and heat-related fatalities. So why, I come from an urban planning background. Why don't we just build more green space in these urban areas that have been so disinvested in over time? Well, one question that we have to ask is, why might people not want green space? And in my work, that is a very valid question, because after decades of disinvestment in these neighborhoods and in infrastructure serving these neighborhoods, the residents of these neighborhoods are often highly suspicious why this, tree planting or building parks now of all times happens to be the issue of focus. Why aren't we thinking about other ways that these neighborhoods have not been served over decades? They may ask who will be responsible for the maintenance and the safety of the space. They may notice that wealthier areas do have more tree canopy cover, but that the city is quicker to pick up leaves during the fall or pick up fallen branches, or they may be doing more proactive maintenance of trees that could damage cars, for example, if branches fall and other property, right? They may also be concerned that greening a neighborhood could result in other kinds of neighborhood change. So a city choosing to reinvest in parks, landscaping, neighborhood beautification through landscaping or planting trees may signal to real estate developers that this is a place that they should invest in, right? Do redevelopment, build new apartments, which triggers other kinds of demographic changes, and also may trigger, rising rents, people being displaced, which we call gentrification, and also maybe even changes in the way the place is policed or has been policed in the past. So from my work, a lot of the issue is really understanding, drawing importance to the understanding of the issue from the perspective of residents. So collecting their experiences of heat as opposed to telling them, hey, it's, you're suffering from this issue, let's fix it. And then standing from their perspective and maybe giving them the language of the science of urban heat islands to help validate or give that scientific language to what they're already expressing to be true. So this is really a different kind of way of doing science, right? Usually the scientists are like, this is what I know, and here I'm going to teach it to you. In this way of doing science, we're actually listening to the community first, and then finding ways that the science can help support them and their priorities. So we do this through design workshops where residents identify potential solutions. They're doing things like mapping local assets, finding places that are cool and hot, and sharing their experiences. But the idea is to let the residents define what the boundaries of the issue are through their experiential knowledge, and then to support their experiences with expert knowledge. So what does that look like? Here's an example of a fishbowl kind of setup where you've got an inner circle. It's a mix of scientists and residents kind of talking about what issues related to heat might be. And a resident can tap in or out and join the conversation, as they see fit, add things, consider things from a different perspective, et cetera. This is an example of that participatory mapping that I mentioned. So mapping areas of the city where residents perceive there to be real problems with heat. So what you see here in red are common paths that people walk to take public transit. And, scientists might not necessarily know that without talking to people. What are the paths that people walk? And where do you perceive there to be a real problem with the heat? And then on the right here is areas that they perceive to be cooler. So some examples of community-defined heat resilience, they are requesting things like drinking water refilling stations along those major transportation routes, because some of them were having to switch buses like 3 times. And if you have 3 kids with you, you're carrying a lot of bottled water around. And they said that that was really, burdensome. And so they identified this solution of making areas where you could refill a refillable water bottle along your way, and making it maximally relevant because it's actually where they go. Cooling and shade stops, again, for those walkers and transit riders. Splash pads and sprinklers for children, those are like little fountains that people can actually go in, which have less liability because you can't drown in them. You don't need to have a lifeguard there, and they can stay open later into the evening after public pools are closed. And then they're requesting advocacy training so that residents know how to navigate, making pitches to city council or the planning department to get more resources for the communities themselves, as opposed to having to rely on other people. So why wouldn't experts just prescribe these same solutions directly to the community? Well, it's really about this process of co-generating or co-producing these solutions. And it's also about meeting residents where they're at in terms of their understanding of the issue. So many of them presumed that extreme heat was, just the way things were, and therefore there's nothing to do about it, and wasn't really high on their list of priorities. If you're prescribing solutions for people and they don't believe that the problem can be addressed or that they can really benefit, then they're not really going to buy into those solutions, and they may be highly suspicious of why you're prescribing these kinds of greening efforts in a neighborhood where no one's cared for so long. So a little bit of my work in Roanoke. I was doing these kind of engagement programs with kids there to see, what kinds of data really resonate with them, what kinds of activities help them understand the issue of heat, what they think about it, what kinds of solutions they think would be best for their communities. And so here you can see they're using Google Street Maps along with a tabletop GIS, which is like a mapping software, to explore different areas of the city. And this was really like, one of the first times that if you ask a 12-year-old, for example, can humans control their outdoor air temperature? Most of them would say no, right? Maybe some of you might even say, no, that's crazy. Like if you wanted to control your temperature, you go inside and you turn your thermostat down. There's nothing to do outside. Like humans can't influence their outdoor air temperature. But when you show them, start having them navigate through Google Street View, visiting different neighborhoods in Roanoke, and making the connection that, these wealthier parts of the city have a lot more trees, have a lot more landscaping, have fewer impervious or hard surfaces that soak up all this heat. And then you also having them explore what the temperatures are in different areas of the city, and have them associate that with zoning practices. Then they start to make the connection that, like humans make these zoning laws, humans shape the built environment, and therefore humans can change the outdoor air temperature. And where we are actually doesn't have a lot of trees, has a lot more parking lots or a lot more streets, and we should be able to do something about that. We flew drones to see, how temperatures change throughout a day and how different materials absorb heat differently. And this really hit that same point home, that like different humans shape what materials are in their environments. We're also going out into their schoolyard at different stations with, different land covers, tree areas, this black kind of very hard, very hot black asphalt, rubberized asphalt track. And then the parking lot to just make those connections even more kind of experiential for them. And then in addition to doing, these scientific or sensing technologies, we also had them interview each other, right, to understand impacts of heat in their lives. Had them sketch solutions for places that they care about, and then had them put together plans for their neighborhood, which is Northwest, on a map. So here they're trying to connect different parks and make them more walkable. So some responses to experiences of heat. How am I doing on time? Am I okay?
You're fine.
Okay. This was from a 12-year-old girl in the group. She said, I went to a hotel room because the heat was so bad it made one of my family members go to the hospital from a heat stroke. She was actually the one who identified that her grandfather was having a heat stroke and the one who called an ambulance. But other students described feeling really uncomfortable because the AC in their home stopped working or was broken, or they never had one. So sleeping on the ground in the living room, taking frequent showers to cool down, putting bottled water in the freezer and then taking it out and sleeping with the bottled water in their bed because it was just like too hot, or feeling like they would faint if they stayed inside, and fighting with their siblings over electric fans. They commented on what data types were useful for them. So I won't get into this too much, but there were different kinds of data that were different for understanding different aspects of the urban heat island effect and its distribution in the city. They really enjoyed the mapping activities where they're able to feel like they're making an impact on their own community and thinking about where would be good places to put, splash pads or green streets or improving tree canopy cover. And they also learned from each other that not everybody has ACs in their homes. And, where their initial reaction to, what do you do when it's hot outside? It was mostly to just go inside and turn up the AC. They realized from interacting with their classmates that not everybody has AC, or AC can break, or if everyone is using AC at the same time, whole areas of a neighborhood could experience a blackout, and then nobody can use an AC. Some examples of their street improvements, sketching, increased trees, but then in their minds, I think this is important to emphasize, street safety is not just a singular issue about increasing tree canopy cover so people don't die of, heat exhaustion. It's also about putting in stoplights to slow down cars that are speeding through their neighborhoods. It's about putting in crosswalks. So other people talked about crime in their neighborhoods, panhandlers, drug dealers. And to them, all of these issues are associated with street safety. And so you can't necessarily just address one aspect of the problem. This is a sketch of a splash pad somebody did. And then evaluating street and park connectivity. So there are, I don't know if some of you might be familiar with Roanoke, but there are greenways, trail systems that go through, parts of the city, but they're not really serving the residential areas. And so what the kids came up with were these green streets that could help link and make walking to the park more comfortable on a hot summer day. So lessons learned as a researcher, we have to have humility as researcher scientists. People know, what the most important issues to them are, and what we call, scientists going into neighborhoods and saying things like, you guys just don't know about heat island effect or whatever. That's called the deficit model, and we tend to reject that as a model of working with communities, and instead think of it much more as partnering with the community, or taking the time to understand what their priorities are. The idea of community efficacy, so more about helping people think of an issue as a social issue rather than an individual problem. We saw this a lot with the kids, not just with heat, but they would tend to say things like, or tend to think of things as like, I don't suffer from food insecurity, I just happen to be hungry right now, or I don't suffer from poverty, I just happen not to have money right now. Or I don't, heat, systemic, issues about heat and extreme heat are not really my problem. I just happen to be hot right now. So having people understand that this is not an individual problem and it's not their fault, certainly, is part of our work, and helping to destigmatize like the shame of not having feeling like you can't solve your own issue because you don't have an air conditioner or you don't have the money to pay for XYZ, and actually having people think of these as systemic social issues that are all actually related to each other. And then, of course, I study relationships between environment and infrastructure. So I tend to think of infrastructure as a social, ecological, and technical system altogether that is extremely resistant to change, because we want our infrastructure to be durable, but the flip side to that is that it's hard to change it, even when it's not functioning like optimally. And then that everybody needs and uses infrastructure, but hardly anyone, really pays attention to what the issues are, and it's kind of a problem that's hidden in plain view. So that's the end of my presentation, and happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wang. Okay, how do I? Okay, I'll leave it like that. Is that okay with everybody? Because so our last speaker is Dr. Vincent Wong, who actually used to be our ACE faculty fellow as well. Dr. Vincent Wong is an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering and Mechanics, BEAM. Within Virginia Tech, he serves as a co-chair of the Asian Pacific Islander Desi American APIDA Caucus, as well as faculty advisor of the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers, SASE. He will present an overview of his lab's approaches to detect and treat orthopedic soft tissue injuries. Thank you, Dr. Wong.
Thank you, Nina, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to present. I thank the audience members for sticking around into the evening here, and hopefully you stay awake through the duration of this talk. So as Nina described, the presentation here is not going to be highly detailed in terms of research. I'm going to actually only have about 5 slides on current research projects. That's really an overview, but I wanted to actually educate you on some of the foundational principles and really what is bioengineering and what is biomechanics, and just so you have some improved context for hearing about the projects. As a standard practice with the scientific research presentations I give at conferences, I'll including my disclosures here. So an academic journey for me, really, it's a personal journey, and as most of you know, or many of you know, my journey started in locally here in Blacksburg, and so from fresh off of graduating from high school at Blacksburg High School, I made a leap of faith and went to the big city, where I ended up earning all of my academic degrees in mechanical engineering. So the reason I didn't study biomedical engineering, which is the discipline that I now teach and research in here at Virginia Tech, is because that major did not exist for us. So I missed out by a couple of years on that major. So a couple of years later, and I would probably have pursued biomedical engineering. So I finished my doctoral research, and I decided that I wanted to stay in academics, but I felt that I wasn't prepared to be competitive in the research environment. So I stayed in academics as a trainee for a couple more years, and I stayed specifically in New York City for another couple of years, and I pursued postdoctoral training to get more intensive research training. I won't get into those details, but I will mention that I performed this research also in a medical center. Okay, so that's Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and that was the Department of Orthopedic Surgery. And following completion of that fellowship, my first faculty position, where I stayed for about 10 years actually. So like Silas, my previous stop was in Illinois, my previous residence. And so I worked at a major medical center in Chicago called Rush University Medical Center, and I was the director of the Sports Medicine Research Laboratory. And that was an exciting time for me because it was the first full-time hire of a scientist that the Division of Sports Medicine offered. And so that was a great opportunity for me. And the reason I'm specifically mentioning these clinical connections is that I didn't have the resources of a strong engineering foundation and colleagues and programs that have enabled my research to further advance since I've come to Virginia Tech. So I'm going to start with a basic definition here. So what is biomedical engineering? So according to the NIH, the BME integrates physical, chemical, mathematical, and/or computational sciences with engineering principles. And the key here is that you're studying biology, medicine, behavior, and/or health. And there's a word cloud down here that I found was pretty helpful in terms of some catchwords that you might see in our discipline of biomedical engineering. So within biomedical engineering, you can study really any organ system, right? The brain, you could study the circulatory system, the blood, right? You can study pulmonary or the breathing organs. I study the musculoskeletal organ system. And so as many of you are well aware of, musculoskeletal diseases have an enormous economic burden and personal burden, health burden. I checked this morning, surprisingly, a lot of these statistics are not updated yet, but they're still very kind of impressive on their own. So looking back 10 years, the economic burden in terms of the gross domestic product, about 6% of the annual GDP was allocated towards the care of musculoskeletal diseases. And this number here is probably an underestimate, as I turn my pointer on here, that 1 in 8 persons of prime working age reported lost work days due to a musculoskeletal injury or ailment. And that's a total of more than 200 million days of lost days of work in 2012. And here's just a pictorial of some common ailments that hopefully you have not experienced yourself, but chances are within your family or close relatives and friends, you're certainly aware of these conditions. So low back pain is shown on the left. This is an X-ray showing the fracture of the femur or your upper leg bone on the right. And the middle panel shows a knee joint. And when you have wearing away of this soft tissue called cartilage, it's a condition called osteoarthritis. And unfortunately, one of the solutions is to actually do a complete resurfacing using synthetic components. So we're replacing this natural biologic material with plastic and metal commonly. So the specific condition that my research lab focuses on is called tendinopathy. So the pathy implies a degeneration, and then the tendon part is with an I, it corresponds to affliction of a tendon, which is spelled with an O. So we can define this condition as a non-inflammatory degeneration, really, of the tissue. And unfortunately, like many other skeletal tissues, nature did not design these tissues to heal very robustly, right? As a result, many interventions are required. Commonly, they would be conservative interventions such as medications or physical therapy. But if failing those therapies, then oftentimes surgery is needed. So what kind of symptoms, right, or how does the tissue present itself really in this disease condition? Well, it's thickened, it's tender, and of course it's painful. That's what sends us to the doctor in the first place, right, is the pain typically, and mechanical weakness. These are very common injuries, not just in sports, in which it's estimated about 50% of sports-related overuse injuries are attributable to tendinopathies, but also in the workplace. About 12% of work-related injuries are attributable to injuries of the tendon. So where are our tendons in our body? These are all sites that you're probably familiar with. The rotator cuff is in your shoulder. In the elbow, it's called you can hear either called tennis elbow or golfer's elbow. The knee, of patellar tendonitis, particularly in activities where you're doing a lot of jumping. And then there's plantar fasciitis in the foot, as well as Achilles tendinosis, which happens to be the particular condition that we study in my group. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about, in a general sense, about biomedical engineering. And within this very, very broad discipline, there are many subdisciplines. And I've actually highlighted in the red box here those subdisciplines which my lab has an interest in. So biomechanics, which is in the title of my presentation, medical imaging, biomedical instrumentation or devices. We're starting to get into some informatics research, and certainly we're very interested in rehabilitation engineering. You may have heard of other applications, including tissue engineering. We're trying to grow replacement body parts, right? Prostheses, I just mentioned the joint replacement. So these are a couple of other examples. So bear in mind that within this large portfolio, right, of tools that we have and approaches that we have, there are a select number that generally you'll see individual labs focused on. So I'm also going to offer you a definition here for biomechanics, because that's one of our primary go-to assessments in our lab. And so we can define it relatively simply as an analysis of physical forces and motion in relation to a biologic or a biomedical system. So maybe the most relatable example is if you're walking or you're running. How much pressure are you putting on your knee joints, right? How many times body weight, right, of force is being transmitted across your knees, across your hip joints with every stride that you take when you're running. We also need to understand that biomechanics is highly relevant to a multi-scale approach, meaning I can study mechanics at the whole body level, I can study at the organ level, I can go to smaller scales and look at the tissue level, the cell level, and even the molecular level. So in my group, we primarily study mechanics at the tissue level. And I'm going to introduce another term here called mechanobiology. It sounds like a complicated term, but in reality, the concept, I think, is readily understood. And perhaps the most relatable example for mechanobiology is spaceflight. So we well understand that when astronauts go into outer space, in that low gravity environment, we understand that the bone mineral density decreases at a rapid rate. And when they come back to Earth, they're at a much higher risk of fracturing their bones. And that's because they lose bone mineral density. To put a number to it, about 1 to 1.6% loss per month that one is in outer space. So that's an extreme example, maybe where you have complete unloading or reduced mechanical loading. Now, what about in a more kind of physiologic type of scenario that we're used to here, since very few of us can go to outer space? Well, in the example of a tendon, which our group studies, right? So this is the calf muscle shown in the red sheen, and it's adjoined to a tendon here. So when we're exercising, let's think about what's happening within the tissue. Right? The tissue is undergoing primarily stretching type deformations. It could be experiencing twisting forces, but realize that tissue transmits the forces transmitted to the tissue, but also to the cells. And really, it's the cells that, when they become mechanically activated or conditioned, they're the ones that govern the response, right? So whether it's maintaining the tissue health response, or whether it's an overuse where it transmits negative signals that break down the tissue, or maybe it's in a healing capacity where they have to have adequate mechanical signaling to maintain the tissue in its homeostatic condition. These are the types of concepts that we study in my group. So I'm going to go to a basic anatomy slide here, because I'm going to be talking about the integration, or this unit here, the muscle, tendon, bone unit. So if we take a cut through our knee joint, and this is just an example, it could be a hip, it could be a shoulder. This is and shown in brown here, this is your upper leg bone, it's called the femur. This is your lower leg bone, it's called the tibia. And I mentioned this on a prior slide, where these two bones meets is a soft tissue layer called cartilage that has a very, very low coefficient of friction. And then the tissues that we study are this complex here. That's the muscle, tendon, bone unit. So any movement of any joint, again, your hip, your ankle, etc., we need to have the coordinated function of this unit. So the muscle contracts, it transmits a force through the tendon that's in turn attached to the bone. Right? So if I have a defect or an injury along this unit, I'm going to probably have some pain and compromised mobility. So again, we're studying the function and disease and injury and repair of the tendon. And then more recently have been studying the influence or the rehabilitative influence of using muscle-based loading. Okay, I'm going to get you involved here for one little question. So here's an application of biomechanics to your everyday life. So why are we at the end of the day a little bit shorter than we were at the beginning of the day. And here are our options. Is it because our bones compress to this extent? Is it because our soft tissues compress to this extent? Or is it inadequate water intake? And I'm on Zoom right now, so I can't see you clearly, but feel free to speak up with your guess, those who are willing to offer a guess.
Guessing but B.
Okay, I hear a B. Do I hear an A or a C?
B.
Okay, so for the sake of time, I'll tell you that the answer is B here. Although I can tell you that C probably hasn't been definitively studied in the context of the skeletal system. So the bad news is that yes, you're a little bit shorter at the end of each day. The good news is that the tissues recover this deformation, and so that you regain that height, or the tissue re-swells or regains its initial height. Typically when we're resting, assuming that we get enough rest. And so, for example, if you drive to work every day, you may find yourself on the return trip home having to adjust your rear view mirror. And that's because you've actually gotten a little bit shorter by the end of the day. Okay, now let's put it another form of, pose a question in another context that many of you, particularly those of you who are sports fans, can maybe relate to. So as a biomedical engineer, how can we improve the clinical management of tendon injuries? A related question could be, can we predict the onset of an injury? So for example, many people pondered, could we have actually predicted, whether it's clinicians or scientists, could we have predicted, right, that Kevin Durant would have ruptured his Achilles tendon? So in terms of my training, I've been, as you saw in one of the very first slides, I've been very fortunate to have worked closely with clinical practitioners. And that's extremely important because I'm not a clinician by training. So if I want to be able to study the most pressing and urgent and timely medical questions in my field, well, I better have a collaborator or colleagues who can inform me and educate me about these specific problems. So in particular, I wanted to point out one of my first mentors actually in graduate school, who then recruited me for a postdoc, is Evan Flato, a world-renowned shoulder surgeon. He's now the president of Mount Sinai West Hospital in New York City. And then prior to coming to VT, I worked with, among others, I worked with Dr. Brian Cole, who is still the team physician for the Chicago Bulls. And small point here, we did not coordinate ties intentionally. So more locally, when I came to Virginia Tech, I sought out clinical collaborators. And in particular, I looked over not very far. I looked within Blacksburg, within the CRC, and I was able to have some very productive dialogues with two physicians in particular. One is Dr. Al Kozar, who specializes in radiology or musculoskeletal imaging. And the other is Dr. Gunnar Brolins, who formerly was the head team physician for all of the Hokie athletic teams. And so we worked together with both of these physicians on a number of different projects, including the ones that I'll describe now. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about, I will gloss over this slide here, but this is giving you kind of a microscopic view of what the pathology looks like in a tendon. So just reorienting you, this is the calf muscle, right? This is your foot, this is the Achilles tendon anchoring to your heel. And if we look at the tendon under the microscope, what we see is actually an altered composition. So very curiously, the cells in this chronic disease are actually making a different kind of tissue. They're making cartilage tissue, which is that material that cushions within your bones, the ends of your bones, but it's also sometimes makes bone, which clearly is not a very desirable type of a response. We wouldn't want to have bone, for example, in our soft tissue structures. So this is just giving you a perspective that we study mechanics, but we're also very interested in studying the morphology and the composition of the tissue, what it's made out of. So here's one of the three projects that I wanted to quickly outline for you, and we were grateful to have support from intramural sources, including VCOM and the School of Veterinary Medicine. And this project is particularly looking at rehabilitation. Now, this is a picture of an individual, happens to be my most recent PhD graduate, Savar Razvani. He's demonstrating this rehabilitation or physical therapy exercise that is used, is commonly used to treat Achilles tendinopathy. Now we actually we've elected, and our approach is actually to study the efficacy of this approach using a preclinical animal model. And I'll very briefly explain to you here how that's done and give you a rationale as to why we do it that way. So we actually we use a simple injection method into the Achilles tendon of these animals. We inject a chemical called TGF-beta. And in a very short time frame, the disease process that replicates the human condition ensues. And so some of the advantages or typical study design, for example, we do the injection at day 0, let's say. And then we can look at various time points to examine the healing response in a temporal fashion, right? What happens early on, what happens kind of mid-course, and then what happens later on. So an animal model or preclinical model allows us this flexibility to do these systematic type studies where we can have a cohort of mice, right, that we induce the injury in, we can treat them differently with different regimens. And more importantly, we can study a number of levels of the tissue and cell processes that we cannot study in humans. Right, so this idea of scientific rigor that NIH talks about a lot, right? Do we have an adequate sample size to generate statistically significant or reliable results? But again, these are amenable to therapeutic treatment. So we try to study this condition in humans. Well, they come to the clinic at different times. They may have more severe pain versus early onset of pain. With an animal model or a preclinical model, we have control, so to speak, over the time course of that disease, and therefore it lends itself well to doing therapeutic assessments in a controlled manner. So I'll skip this for the sake of time. This is a picture from the laboratory showing you how we do the mechanical testing of tissues. Here's a second project area now, and it is thematically similar to the muscle loading project. And so I neglected to mention my title of my presentation is "What's the Fuss About Biomechanics?" And you've stayed with me this long for the presentation, and now you get the punchline. So it's a pun because FUS stands for focused ultrasound. So we're looking into the feasibility of using a therapeutic ultrasound approach to promote tendon healing. So similar to the muscle loading project, where we're looking in the prior slide, where the effect of doing these exercises, right? That's a mechanical stimulus of the injured tendon. Here we're asking ourselves, well, can we achieve this mechanical stimulation using an external means, right? In this case, we're using focused ultrasound. So you're all familiar, having been in your mother's womb, having received an ultrasound when you were, even before you were born. That's called diagnostic ultrasound. We can use ultrasound as a therapeutic if we kind of program that unit to deliver higher intensity pulses, maybe more frequent pulses, or certainly higher pressures that can induce either a thermal or a mechanical stimulus to the tissue. So we're looking at this as an alternative treatment. For example, some patients may not be compliant and may not want to do physical therapy, or maybe it's too painful to do physical therapy. So this might be an alternative, hopefully a viable alternative, whereby we can hopefully achieve the same effects that we can through exercise, but using this non-invasive ultrasound technique. I'm drawing to a close here, and so I'll point out this particular slide. Everyone should be familiar, I'm expecting, with facial recognition, right? You have your social media app, and it's smart, and it knows, oh, it asks you, is this so-and-so? Is this your brother, right? Or is this your significant other? Tag them that person. So what if we were to use a very similar technology to facial recognition, but instead of looking at a photograph of a human face, what if we looked at a medical image? That is the premise of this study. So we're using artificial intelligence or machine learning, which is the catchword that you probably heard in the media, or radiomics, essentially. So can we use machine learning to, quote unquote, diagnose a tendon injury from an ultrasound image? And so working with Dr. Kozar, we've compiled over 2,000 images from the men's and women's basketball teams here with the Hokies. We looked at preseason and postseason, and Dr. Kozar has classified these images as either injured or uninjured. And then we train the machine learning code, right, to learn some of those features that we cannot visualize with the naked eye. And then we ask it to predict, right, or to categorize the remaining images as to whether they are injured or uninjured. And so our hope is that we can achieve better accuracy than an experienced clinician could. And furthermore, this might serve as a helpful training tool, right, for medical students, for residents, or even clinical practitioners who do not have the perhaps the set of resources to do ultrasound that others do. And so this is just a schematic of the kind of the workflow where we're hoping to expand the data set to tens of thousands of images and be able to use a technique called parallel computing to do this analysis in a very, very rapid sense, in a rapid rate, hopefully on the order of a minute or less, in fact. Okay, so thanks again for your attention and your patience, and I, along with the other panelists, will be happy to take questions at this point.
I think if you could stop sharing. Okay.
Can I turn off my pointer slide button?
Thank you so much for a great sort of just presentation for all three of you. I don't know if we want to start off with the participants or the audience members. Do you have any questions for any of the panelists, presenters at all? Yes.
For Theo Lim, the second presentation, I know the kids that you worked with all had they brainstormed solutions for their own neighborhoods, and what did you guys end up doing with those solutions that they created? Did they send them to any local representatives to be carried out with?
That's a great question, and this project is actually ongoing. And so we just finished up the citizen engagement part in the summer. The next steps are to take the results of that engagement and see to what extent they can actually result in new political coalitions to do anything about heat and different experiences of heat and vulnerability within a city. Like legally, they're not required to do anything. And so it's hard to find resources to do that if you don't have to do it. And so what we're trying to do is build coalitions of people, leaders from nonprofit, influential members of city council, other residents, to try to pressure the city to do things proactively as opposed to responding to emergencies when extreme heat happens. So yeah, engaging with the kids was the first step, but then we're going to expand it to engaging with more of the residents, and then also finding these political coalitions.
Also, people can also ask if you're in the Zoom as well, if you want to ask questions in the chat, that's also possible. Any other questions, comments, or just even comments or things you learned? One? Yes.
So Silas mentioned the class that he's teaching coming up, but I was wondering for Theo and Vincent, do you guys teach any classes coming up in the spring?
Yes, thanks, Gia. So I have 2 courses currently scheduled. One's undergraduate and one's graduate. They both are involve applying mathematical models or developing mathematical models to describe biomedical systems behavior.
Yep, I teach 2 classes in the spring. One is called Urban Infrastructure, and the other one is called Data and the Art of Policy and Planning.
Thank you.
Both undergraduate classes.
So you can definitely take classes with the professors here as well. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Cassinelli. So regarding the transnational adoptees, how would you say the Chinese one-child policy affected
That's a great question. So the way that scholars tend to think about policies like one-child policies is thinking about the relationship between the state and how the state in any country likes to intervene on family practices. And so adoption is a very kind of seems maybe obvious example of the state participating or helping or encouraging families to come together, and adoption is like the family practices that happen across different countries or between different countries. But it's important to remember that any sort of state of a nation is invested in what families look like in that country, and like to shape how families function, because how families function is imagined to benefit the country or the nation. So something that I teach in my classes, both in what I'm teaching right now, which is Introduction to Women Gender Studies, and also when I teach my Asian American Studies classes, is that scholars like to talk about how population is a form of power for nations. It creates resources. The population numbers create workers, potential soldiers, but it's just a resource. Who we are, the population of a country is not just how many people happen to live in a country, it's also about how that serves as a resource. So then to speak a little bit more directly to like how that affects adoption, I am not as familiar with Chinese adoption policies because I focus on Korea. Uh, and so the very many social kind of political factors that go into why children are available for adoption, I do imagine, I would say that the one-child policy is a practice that is parallel to adoption practices. They're all kind of within the same, they share space with each other, is how I would talk about it. But I would have to defer to somebody who studies Chinese adoption to, to kind of fully answer that question.
Thank you.
Think so.
Anyone else have questions?
You're so engaged. Like I was watching them, like watching you all. So it was really nice to sort of see the engagement level as well.
Was it my cat? Was it when my cat showed up? Oh, she just meowed. She knows I'm talking about her.
I do want to say thank you so much for giving these presentations, because I know these professors on more of a personal level and sort of more administrative level. So it was really nice to hear your presentations and your research, because I know nothing about your research except for maybe Dr. Cassinelli's, but everybody else, like I know nothing, especially as people know about me in science. I don't do science. So thank you for quote unquote dumbing it down for me. Dr. Lim and Dr. Wong. I did have a question for Dr. Wong too, because you said you were in mechanical engineering. So what was the process like for learning about the human body, if you're talking about mechanics and stuff like that? I think if you could answer that, that would be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So a lot of it is kind of on the job training, so to speak, and don't tell anyone, but even the biostatistical tools that I use, I have formal training in biostatistics. So in that sense, I would make the argument that for an engineer to learn concepts like anatomy and biology, right, is hopefully will be less challenging, right, than studying advanced mathematics and these types of coding and so on. But it's immersion, right, and exposure. And again, remember the environment that I was trained in and spent the early part of my career in was very much devoted to anatomy. And as a graduate student, I helped with tissue dissections, working alongside physicians in training. So that was a really, really valuable experience that you really cannot get I think, unless you are doing research, in fact. So I think I absorbed everything like with a sieve, as a sieve, because I was just so engrossed and eager to learn the relevant anatomy, at least.
Vincent, what I want to know is, in the two photos where you talked about who you worked with and trained under, were you in that first photo?
I was, yeah, that was a very young, naive trainee at that point. But yes, I was on all the way on the right side of, if you remember the photograph, with an apron on.
I wasn't sure if that was you. I thought maybe it was.
I'm no longer young, sadly, but yes, at one point I was.
You looked so eager.
Good eye.
And Dr. Lim, I actually had a question for you about working with like little kids, because I don't know if your training teaches you to go into like schools to do this work. Like how sort of what was that process like? And did you also have to do an IRB for all of that? And how does that work?
Yeah, so that was my first time working with kids. I mean, and in a research setting. I have a kid, but of course he's much younger. In some senses, it wasn't that different from working with my kid who's 4. But anyway, middle school. It was the first time I had been back in a middle school since I myself was in middle school. So that was it was kind of interesting. The smell of the building just brought everything back. But anyway, yeah, and then IRB. IRB is a little bit more involved because we are collecting data from minors. And so in addition to getting their consent, minors cannot provide consent. You have to get minors' assent, and then consent comes from their parents. And so what the difficulty of that is that once you send a form home to get a parent's signature, especially for a summer program, there's no kind of guarantee that that form will ever come back. And so we were not able to get everybody, collect everybody's data, but we do the program with everyone. It's just that we're not able to use the research. We're not able to use everybody's data for research purposes. So we got about 25 people out of 40 something return their forms. So that's still pretty good. I think we have enough data to analyze.
Theo, did you find that children answered? Do you give children and adults kind of the same questions? And did children give you very different answers?
Well, all of the material that we designed for them was designed for 6th grade through 8th grade. So that's different, right, than you would do with an adult. But in some ways, I feel like the interview at the end, where we're actually doing the data collection, was in many ways easier because kids they have less to hide. They don't feel as self-conscious about things that as adults would. And so they would just tell you what worked, what didn't work. And even, their personal experiences much more readily than adults might.
Theo, I had a question for you as well. So it actually regards Roanoke as your urban model, right? So I understand the proximity, very favorable, all things considered. Have you considered, partnering, or maybe you actually are partnering with others, let's say in Richmond, right, or kind of the next scale up in terms of size? What are your thoughts on looking at kind of extrapolating, right, the tools and the applications to a different urban setting?
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to have that opportunity. I think, the choice of Roanoke was mainly for convenience, to collect our preliminary data. But the issue of different vulnerabilities within a city happens in every city. And actually Richmond, the science center there, does a lot around heat and vulnerability. And they've put on like a whole mapping, like for cities all over the United States of like how redlining corresponds with heat exposure and all that. So yeah, what we're trying to work on is more like, how does this translate into around. And for that, it just much more convenient to be within, an hour just drive of the place we're engaging with.
Field work, right?
Thank you, everybody. I want to be cognizant of your time, so I really, really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for staying. And hopefully we'll be doing more learning lunches and inspiration series so keep on or be on the lookout for that. And thank you, everybody, for coming and staying. Thank you for those in the audience in Zoom as well as out here as well. Appreciate all of you. And thank you again, my peers, and for supporting me in all the work that I do for at the ACE as well.
Thank you, Nina.
Thanks, Nina.
Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
How do I stop recording? Ow.